HaYehudim, the Jewish people accepted upon themselves what they had started to accept the giving of the Torah in Har Sinai. And it seems that the giving of the Torah was the ideal time to accept the giving of the Torah because spiritual heights, physical heights, everything seemed properly aligned. Purim does not seem to be either of those times. So why is Purim the time when we culminate the giving of the Torah? Because Purim, we displayed active Mesiras Nefesh. As in, Purim, they risked themselves to keep Torah mitzvahs. There's something about the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim that they're willing to die for Torah mitzvahs, that cements the acceptance of the Torah. And Mordechai, who was the Moshe Rabbeinu of the generation, brought that out within the people, specifically teaching Torah to the 22,000 school children. When Haman came, they were willing to go for Mordechai. They say there's like a story with the Frierdiker Rebbe that because of everything that was going on in those days, and he's trying to maintain this network of all these schools and keeping Torah alive in Russia, because Russia, Eastern Europe was basically the epicenter of Judaism then. They said there was a Farbrengen, I don't know if it was this Farbrengen, whatever Farbrengen was, and he ripped his shirt open, and he said, if you see this body burn, don't stop teaching Torah. He was fully expecting that he would be shot, expecting to that point that they might kill me for this, but don't let that sway you from doing what has to be done. What we get to, and this is the summary of the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maamar, is that why does Purim culminate the giving of the Torah is because they displayed active Mesiras Nefesh. And then the Rebbe asks questions on it. Why are we talking about Mordechai and the school children? That seems a detour. Why are we talking about the physical state of the Jewish people, not just the spiritual state? Why is there such a big emphasis on Mesiras Nefesh? Of course, the generations before would have been willing to have Mesiras Nefesh. So why do we focus so much on it? And also, we're supposed to live by the mitzvahs, not about dying, about living. And Purim and Hanukkah, 2 times they had to risk themselves. So what is about Purim? And we saw a text with Mesiras Nefesh. We come to the fact there is something about Purim and the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim, but that's what culminates the giving of the Torah. To understand this fully, we have to understand what the giving of the Torah is all about. So the giving of the Torah was not just about telling us the list of the laws, because we know the forefathers, on some level, they kept the Torah. The giving of the Torah is about the fusion. Physical and spiritual worlds that have become separate can now impact each other. Specifically, the physical world could be transformed, elevated, etc. by the spiritual world. How do 2 things that are so opposite unite with something greater overrides? And that was the revelation of God, God's essence at Har Sinai now allows for the fusion. And we see how that's now taken, this idea of taking the physical, taking the spiritual, fusing to a whole new level. We see how that applies with mitzvahs and with Torah study. And we see there's a through line between all the different aspects that we have. 3 aspects of the mitzvah after Matan Torah. Tachton, the lower aspect, physical stays physical. Elyon, the higher aspect, spiritual stays spiritual. And then we're going to have the fusion of the 2. That means both sides have to give up to be more. So batel, the subjugation, that's when we take everything to a whole new level. This becomes possible only after Matan Torah. So after the giving of Torah, this is what becomes possible in our Torah mitzvahs. How do we see that? We see the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. The lower aspect, motivated by the habits of the body, the animal soul. That's what drives the mitzvah doing. Like, this is what we do. This is part of the routine. We're doing things by road. Just why we saw text about how to get out of doing things by road. You need extra love to take you to a whole new level. Elyon, the higher aspect, that's a desire to connect to Hashem. That's motivated by the soul, the neshama. I love God so much, I'm going to do what He wants me to do. Then we get to a whole new level, taking both sides and fusing to get to a whole new level. We do the mitzvahs because we're given over to God, and so He has commanded, and so we do. The other elements don't come into play. Then we see these apply to the 3 approaches to the mitzvahs in general. The mitzvahs were given to refine man in creation. Why do we shech like this? Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Because it refines everything. And the higher aspect is that mitzvahs were given so we could walk in Hashem's ways and connect with Him levels above creation. So it's not just about whatever the physical world is, but God does mitzvahs, we do mitzvahs. God has certain attributes and we're supposed to mimic them. God is kind, you be kind. The verses, the Torah teaches us what that looks like. Mercy, all these different things. And then batel is that mitzvahs make man significant and connecting to the essence of the commandment. Mitzvah is the language of connection. Tzafsa and chibur. Not just about refinement and not just about doing as God does, but actually connecting to God Himself. Lots of text on that. That brings us now to the motivation of Torah learning. We did all the mitzvahs things and I already see it in Torah study. Tachton, the lower aspect, is for the benefit of the intellect. That anybody to connect to. Like, oh, there's so much wisdom and smartness in this. Let's study Torah because I want to feed my brain. Elyon, the higher level, is that we're motivated by the soul that wants to connect to God. We take it to the next level, not just about the intellect, but we're going to the spiritual realms. And then about both of them is that there's no motivation that has anything to do with me. Torah must be studied. We saw lots of text with that. Part of that was the text that we saw about how usually when you acquire an item, you don't acquire the owner with it. But when God gave us the Torah, He gave Himself along with it. Through getting the Torah, we got God Himself. That connects to the first word of the 10 Commandments that Sarah Sedibra says Anochi, not Ani. Ani is how we say I in Hebrew. Anochi, well, they say it's maybe an Egyptian word. That's also an acronym for Ananachi Ksavs Yavis, that I have written my soul into it. So God gave us Himself when He gave us the Torah. That brings us to the 3 approaches to Torah, that Torah is Hashem's wisdom. How can we understand God's wisdom? We can't, but He compacted it somehow and gave it to us in a Torah that we can now study. On the higher level, Torah is a tool and means to connect with Hashem. We saw with other texts about how it's like the knot that connects the Jewish people and Hashem. And Batel Torah is one with essence of Hashem. It aligns with all the texts that we saw for the one before. Because we see there's like a through line for all of these. That brings us to the last aspect, which is the 3 approaches to learning halacha, to learning the law itself. Tachton, the lower aspect, we study the primary focus on practical halachas. The lower aspect, why do we study? Because we got to know what we're supposed to be doing. Literally, we got to know what to do. And that we even saw the thing from Tanya about how the godly soul comes into the body to do actions, because action is what impacts the body and the animal soul, not just stuff that stays up in the mind. We have to do physical actions to physically affect the world. On the higher levels, that we study the whole Torah, regardless of the practical application, studying all the Torah. No matter if it's a mitzvah that's relevant right now, and it has been done before, that you could actually study the whole Torah, as in all the texts and all the everything. Taking it to the next level, that's where we have the verse of Vaygisa V'yom V'layla. We study to meditate on Torah day and night without any goals. It has nothing to do with the intellect, it has nothing to do with what I know or what I don't know, what my intellectual capacities are, because everyone at their capacity can study all the time. All that was the bulk, the middle section of the Maamar, which leads us finally to the answers to the question. We didn't necessarily answer the questions. In order, the first question we answered is that why was Mesiras Nefesh so important? So we spoke about how the physical, as in they actually have to display Mesiras Nefesh, is so important, because we said that the body is as committed, because just willing to have Mesiras Nefesh means that the soul, which the soul understands God on a different level than the body does, the soul is connected to God on a different level than the body. So if it's just coming from the soul, it's just this willingness, the soul is overriding the body. But when they had actual Mesiras Nefesh at Purim, that means the body came along with it. Yes, we are totally committed to this Torah, even to the point past life itself. Question number 4, that was the one about Purim and Hanukkah. So there were both times that the Jewish people risked themselves for Torah mitzvahs. So what is it specifically about Purim that's so distinct? Mesiras Nefesh means the self-sacrifice, comes from the desire of the soul to connect to Hashem. Usually that's the soul flaming up. Sidetrack, if you remember when we did this in Tanya, it was talking about how a Jew, because of the hidden love that we have in our DNA, passed down from the forefathers, it's just ingrained within a Jewish person. When there's a time of spiritual crisis, it will flare up. And the person will say, no, I can never ever be disconnected from God, God forbid. The Alter Rebbe wanted us to take that approach and say, don't wait for the spiritual crisis. Know that any transgression, there's a moment of separation in any transgression. So apply that same idea here and say, wait, I don't want to do this because I can never be separated from God. Point is, where does it come from? It's embedded in the soul. First thing told us, we don't want it to just be in the soul, we want the body to be part of that as well. Mesiras Nefesh comes from the desire of the soul to connect to Hashem, which influences the body and animal soul to have Mesiras in actuality. Like this, the bittul of the body and animal soul is from the external influence of the godly soul. We see these answers are connected. So when it's the soul impressing upon the body, it's not the body deciding on its own, it's the soul convincing it. Therefore, the resulting acceptance of Torah and corresponding revelation in the world would be externally imposed and not a transformation of the physical world itself. So here it's taking it not just about the Mesiras Nefesh, it's saying in general that whatever can be accomplished when it's only the soul that's driving everything and not necessarily the body and the animal soul also being part of it, then it's this externally imposed influence and not an actual transformation. We'll get you to come along, but we haven't convinced you yet to be part of this. The decree of Purim was against the Jews' physical body, and because Achashverosh rules the civilized world, there was nowhere to run. The worst possible physical situation for the Jews. This resulted in the bittul of the body and animal soul themselves completing the acceptance of the Torah. Purim versus Hanukkah, Purim time, Achashverosh ruled the whole civilized world. There was nowhere that anybody could go. And the decree was not just about Judaism. It wasn't like, look, if you stop doing this mitzvah, then you'll be fine. No, Haman wanted to destroy the body itself. Hanukkah was primarily a religious decree in which Torah mitzvahs were forbidden and not a direct threat to the physical body. So they were only in danger if you followed Torah mitzvahs. So Mesiras Nefesh would have been externally imposed on the body and animal soul and not sufficiently complete. So you remember we say we always take things to a new level. So Hanukkah, yes, they had to risk themselves. But technically, in theory, if they just weren't outwardly Jewish, then they wouldn't have been in danger. To get along, they weren't trying to exterminate the Jews themselves, per se. They're trying to exterminate the godliness of Judaism. They wanted God out of the picture. It's not Torah, oh, this is a great thing. There's so much wisdom in this. Purim was different. Just your physical body itself has to go. God forbid. It's a very different situation because one's more of a spiritual fight and one's an actual physical fight. And the option to convert out, which no one did anyways, in theory there was an option they could have said like, oh, I'm not Jewish anymore, God forbid, and then it would have been saved, but nobody did that anyways. Still, the decree focused on the Jew's physical body and thereby brought about the bittul of the body with a direct threat to physical life. So because it was the physical life that was threatened, the body becomes nullified in saying, yes, I'm willing to give myself up for God. On the other hand, the decree of Hanukkah was to make them forget your Torah and turn them away from your mitzvahs. Remember, we say in the Alanisim, your Torah, your mitzvahs, God's Torah, God's mitzvahs, primarily risking the Jew's spiritual life and soul. A Jew's life is only in danger once he chose to preserve his spiritual life by keeping Torah mitzvahs, a conditional physical threat not experienced with the same intensity. So yes, Hanukkah was not a great time, kind of a little bit of a terrible time. If we're going to be frank about things, Hanukkah was a not good time at all, but it's still mainly terrible, but Purim was even more terrible. Purim, because it was even more terrible, Purim achieved a much higher level because of the way that it was able to bring the physical body along to this commitment of Mesiras Nefesh. This is from Rambam Hilchos Yesodei Torah. This text here is showing us the differences between different kinds of threats and the way we respond to them. So we see there are times that there's variances. Yes, there's a threat, but can it be dealt with or not? Rambam talks about, if anyone about whom it is said, transgress and do not sacrifice your life, sacrifices his life and does not transgress, he is held accountable for his life. This kind of connects a little bit to the text that we saw about Mesiras Nefesh. When does a person have to actually sacrifice himself for Torah mitzvahs? Even there that we saw there were differences, there were variances. is. If it's totally in private and it's like quote unquote like a smaller mitzvah, can he still transgress to save himself? Is it's not as big of a deal if it's in public or if it's one of the bigger mitzvah or one of the three? When anyone about whom it is said, sacrifice your life and do not transgress, sacrifices his life and does not transgress, he sanctifies God's name. Just talking about the difference between the mitzvahs of like this mitzvah you can transgress to save yourself versus this one you can't. If he does so in the presence of 10 Jews, he sanctifies God's name in public like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues. So remember Daniel was thrown into lion's den. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown into a furnace, just like their forefather Abraham, and Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues. Rabbi Akiva was one of the 10 martyrs. Among those that they all sacrificed themselves for God's name. Some of them survived the encounter and some of them did. These are those slain by the wicked kingdom above whom there is no higher level. Concerning them, the verse states, for your sake we have been slain all day, we are viewed as sheep for the slaughter, and gather to me my pious ones, those who have made a covenant with me by slaughter. Talking about how the level that those who died to sanctify God's name, the level that they're on. When anyone about whom it is said, sacrifice your life and do not transgress instead of sacrifice his life, he desecrates God's name. Either the mitzvah or the setting where a person is supposed to sacrifice themselves rather than transgress, if he tries to save himself, then it's a desecration of God's name instead of a sanctification of God's name. If he does so in the presence of 10 Jews, he desecrates God's name in public, nullifies the fulfillment of the positive commandment of the sanctification of God's name, and violates the negative commandment against the desecration of God's name. Two mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah to sanctify God's name, there's a mitzvah not to desecrate God's name. Rambam is bringing it in that they both get transgressed. Nevertheless, since he was forced to transgress, he is not punished by lashing, and needless to say, he is not executed by the court, even if he was forced to slay a person. The punishments of lashes and execution are administered only to one who transgresses voluntarily, when the transgression is observed by witnesses, and when a warning was given, as the verse states, concerning one who gives his children to the worship of Molech. Molech is the idol that they used to sacrifice kids for. I'll turn my face against that person. So here it's just showing variances that if a person was forced to transgress versus willingly transgress, punishment for that. The oral tradition teaches that we can infer that person and not one who is forced to transgress, who transgresses inadvertently or transgresses because of an error. If concerning the worship of false gods, which is the most serious of sins, a person who is forced to worship is not liable for karet. Karet is if the soul is cut off. Then God will make a person die young. Nowadays, we don't necessarily have the same spiritual impact, so we don't always necessarily see spiritual retribution right away. Nor, needless to say, execution by court. How much more so does this principle apply regarding the other mitzvahs of the Torah? Similarly, regarding forbidden relations, Torah states do not do anything to the maiden. One who could, however, escape and flee from under the power of a wicked king and fails to do so is like a dog who returns to lick his vomit. That's disgusting. He is considered as one who worships false gods willingly. He will be prevented from reaching the world to come and will descend to the lowest levels of Gehenna. The short of it is, we're seeing that there's variations in things and do this, don't do this, what a person would transgress or not transgress, and also the subsequent punishments. But we see even there's times that if a person transgresses, the punishment might be different, even though he shouldn't have done that because he was coerced, dictated, etc. If Gentiles tell a group of women, give us one of you to defile, if not, we'll defile all of you, they should allow themselves all to be defiled rather than give over a single Jewish soul to the Gentiles. Similarly, if Gentiles told a group of Jews, give us one of you to kill, if not, we'll kill all of you, they should allow themselves all to be killed rather than give over a single soul to Gentiles. So this is talking about a message to a group versus an individual. However, the Gentiles single out a specific individual and say, give us so-and-so, or we'll kill all of you, different rules apply. If the person is obligated to die like Sheva ben Bichri, they may give him over to them. Initially, however, this instruction is not conveyed to them. If he is not obligated to die, they should allow themselves all to be killed rather than give over a single soul to them. There's eight differences, the variances of risking the life, but we see also here when it comes to the group, there's an absolute Mesiras Nefesh that applies here than when we're talking about a single individual. Answer to question number 2. Why is Mesiras Nefesh so important? But it's the whole thing is to live by the mitzvahs is because Mesiras Nefesh is what solidifies the fact that the body is part of this also. Why is it Purim versus Hanukkah? Because Purim was an absolute threat. It wasn't something conditional that it came to a single individual. Hanukkah, if a person wasn't outwardly Jewish, they technically could have saved themselves because the threat was a spiritual threat. It was against Judaism, which again, that's why it's remarkable that they fought for that, but it wasn't the threat against the body itself. Question number 2. Why compare the Jewish people's physical state at Purim to the giving of the Torah instead of only the spiritual state, as that's what's relevant in accepting Torah? They're all tying into each other. Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, enabled complete bittul to Hashem in spiritual and physical world. A person can now wholly give themselves over to God, not just in a physical way, but also in a spiritual way, whereby they could unite as one. Ergo, Jews needed to accept the Torah with bittul of souls and bodies. Accomplished at Purim, both levels were difficult. The physical situation was a critical aspect to complete acceptance of the Torah. Why are we talking about the physical aspect of things? Because the physical aspect was vital to the complete acceptance of the giving of the Torah. The giving of the Torah, because it allowed both worlds to come together, the physical and the spiritual allowed for the fusion to come together, we needed both worlds per se, both parts of ourselves to be united in this. So the physical body and the spiritual soul. So soul and body together had to be part of this. Again, that's why the physical aspect was an actual vital component to the complete acceptance. We'll answer the last question, then you'll see there's going to be more texts that kind of round off the Maamar itself. Question number 1. The Jewish people completed their acceptance of Torah Purim because of Mesiras Nefesh. Why emphasize that Mordechai raised them to this level? The topic is how, not who. Why the added detail about Mordechai's focus on the school children. It seems like Mordechai and the school children are detours Torah. Why are we adding it in here? After the giving of the Torah, every mitzvah has three aspects: the lower, higher, and both subjugated to revelation of Or and Sof. That's what we kept seeing: Tachton, Elyon, and the Batel level. The Bittul of Mesiras Nefesh, Bittul means the nullification of the self. The Bittul of Mesiras Nefesh accomplishes the third aspect, but the body, the lower, and the soul, the higher, also need to achieve their ultimate potential. This is similar to the advantage of Torah study for its own sake, wherein a person not only surpasses his selfish, quote-unquote, selfish desire to learn, which is the aspect number 3, the Bittul, but also learns in a way that transcends the limits of time and space, achieving his ultimate potential, aspects 1 and 2. Purim, the third aspect, was achieved through Mesiras Nefesh, but the ultimate potential of their body and soul, aspects 1 and 2, wasn't. Basically, we went through this whole thing about how we had to have the body and the soul had to be united in this Mesiras Nefesh. But the whole thing of the fusion, when you have body and soul united, that means that you've reached the third level. So the Jewish people had Mesiras Nefesh on the third level because body and soul came together and said, yes, we will sacrifice ourselves. But we don't want to skip the first 2 levels also. We want it to be a through line. We want it to be true all the way through. As Mordechai was the Moshe of his generation, his actions affected the entire Jewish people, just like the head influences and directs all the limbs of the body. The Rebbe would be our Moshe, the Moshe Rabbeinu of our generation. Mordechai studied Torah at the ultimate level of perfection for body and soul. So when he inspired the Jews to Mesiras Nefesh for Torah, he transmitted this ultimate level of learning to them. Thus, the Jewish people achieved the ultimate expression of serving Hashem through body and soul, as well as ultimate bittul of body and soul. They need to complete acceptance of the Torah. So they weren't just willing to nullify themselves for God, but also we have to get back to the physical level. We have to have ultimate, spiritual level ultimate, and then subjugation level ultimate, the batel level, bittul. So bittul, the Jewish people achieved physically with Purim, all the things that we said until now. Mordechai helped them fill in the rest of those levels. Mesiras Nefesh means breaking personal limitations to break limitations and barriers between heaven and earth. Remember, we've seen this in a lot of Maamar. We're going to go beyond ourselves and we want that mirrored in the spiritual terms by God up above. So we're going to go past our own barriers and we want the barriers that separate physical and spiritual, or we want God to also go beyond limitations, measurable stuff. Mesiras Nefesh doesn't necessarily mean not existing, but that body and soul through Moshe become a vessel for godliness. To not just die for Torah, but live for Torah. Wherein the only reality is fulfilling Hashem's will. Torah gives you a you to learn. Hashem commands mitzvahs and brings you into existence to fulfill them. What do we mean here? Once the Jewish people got to the level that they're willing to sacrifice themselves to Torah, they have Mesiras Nefesh, Torah mitzvahs, now it's time to live at that level. So it's not just having reached that level in the moment of the threat during Purim, but now once the whole Purim story is over, to keep living at that level that they reached, that level where everything they're willing to totally give themselves over to God, past the point of life itself. So now that you didn't die, and we don't want you to die, now we want you to keep that level and bring it into living. Mordechai, who's the Moshe, facilitates that for us. It's not just going past the point of life itself, but it's bringing that into life, to be able to live at that level, totally given over. We saw with all the aspects. That third aspect was always just Torah for its own sake, mitzvahs for their own sake. We just do it because so it is, without taking anything else into account. So once we reach the level, thank God we don't have to give up life. Now it's time to keep living, maintaining that level, but through living at that level. So Mordechai is the one who facilitates that, so we can live like that. We saw it in one of the examples about how mitzvahs make man significant, because God is just the ultimate. We can't comprehend, we get nowhere near to what God is. God created this world, and everything is just nothing before God in the world. Then God gave Torah mitzvahs, that he said, you will do Torah, you'll do mitzvahs. We now become relevant. We now become significant. Now that you've totally given yourself up, you recognize that your own nothingness, you recognize your own nullification to everything. Now we need you to keep existing in this body to do Torah mitzvahs, the Torah that God commanded and the mitzvahs that God commanded. And now you are this vessel, you are this someone who can now fulfill Torah and the mitzvahs. All is to say that this is the level that we achieve at Purim. This is why Purim is so significant, and this is why it culminates the giving of the Torah, because this is the level that we reach. Specifically, Mordechai helps facilitate not only the reaching of the level, but bring it down into the actual living at that level.